we've forgotten how to learn. Whether we're educators or we're the leaders or we're staff within an institution, we have given up our ability to learn about our business and our operation and our approach and our pedagogical practices. We, in many ways, refuse to learn about our business and our operation and our people and to continue to improve ourselves. And I think that's one of the fundamental challenges that we face.
Hello, and welcome to the Future podcast series by UIN. I am Valzhano Razbaeva, Director of Research and Training at UIN, and I'm your host for today. For this episode, I spoke with Cameron McCoy, founder of the Adaptive Group, about why many transformation efforts in higher education fall short and what it really takes to create lasting change. We unpacked the idea of adaptive evolution, moving beyond quick fixes to address root causes, rethink core systems, and build institutions that are truly change-ready, learner-centered, and capable of evolving in a rapidly shifting world. Today's conversation focuses on a challenge that many of you may be navigating directly or indirectly, but universities are certainly under growing pressure to evolve, whether due to shifting learner expectations, financial constraints, or wider technological change or societal change. And yet much of that response we see across the sector still tends to be rather incremental. And there might be new programs or maybe small initiatives here and there without necessarily addressing the deeper systems underneath. And this is exactly where today's theme comes in, moving from quick fixes to what Cameron McCoy would call adaptive revolution, a more systemic and sustained way of thinking about transformation, a concept that Cameron explores in his contribution to the Future of University Thought book, Entrepreneurial Edition. Cameron brings a particularly rich perspective to this. He is the founder of the Adaptive Group and Rebound Edu, and he has held a number of senior leadership roles across multiple universities in the United States. So his work sits really in the intersection of institutional strategy, operations, and future-focused models for higher education. So Cameron, welcome. It's great to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me, Baljan, and thank you to those of you who are joining us and for your patience. We had a bit of a challenge the other day due to severe weather, but I'm happy we could reschedule and do this today and that those of you who are here could join us.
The sun is shining in Amsterdam. Hope it does for you as well. But yeah, thanks for making it.
Yeah, happy to do it. It's actually, I don't know about you guys, but we had very warm weather yesterday and it'll be perfect today, but still sunny and hot all of a sudden.
That's a great starting point for us to start.
Amen. Yeah.
All right. So, Cameron, in your contribution to the Future of University Thought book, you describe a sector that's responding to pressure, but perhaps not always in ways that actually help shift the underlying system. And this is where I'd like to start, perhaps. When you speak with university leaders today, what are the most common challenges that they would be bringing to you? And why does it feel, you think, so difficult sometimes for institutions to respond to them in a more fundamental way? Because we see a lot of activity, whether we talk about small isolated initiatives, small projects, supporting mechanisms that are being introduced. But where do you see these efforts falling short?
Goodness, that's a big question. There's a lot there, but I think, and we'll talk about this more a little bit later, I think, but fundamentally, institutions aren't change ready. They're not adaptive. And that plays out across the organization in a number of ways. Certainly plays out among the human beings who work there. It plays a role in the reflection of the way the organization is structured, but there are also factors that are fundamentally out of control for universities. And when we think about the pressures that universities are facing today, they're pretty immense. And I think part of the challenge is that we have failed to recognize that there are significant compressive factors and significant reshaping factors that are really forcing instability and challenging us to focus on root causes and solve for approaches that are more proactive rather than reactive. So I'll give you some examples here. On the compressive side, when we look at institutions, part of the challenge here is, particularly in the US and much of the way I think about things is focused on the US because that's where I am, but I think they're applicable certainly across the world. From a compressive standpoint, there's a market factor around what we call the bachelor's degree imperative. So if you look at the data, there is a really strong positive correlation between GDP growth and bachelor's degree conferrals. It's almost a one-to-one relationship. So to put that into context for the United States, we're an economy in stable times that grows roughly 2.6 to 2.9% on an annual basis. And if we were to extract that into bachelor's degree conferrals, that means that we need to effectively double the number of bachelor's degrees that we're conferring by 2035. And that's at the same time that we're seeing fundamental shifts in institutions themselves, right? So you can imagine that that's causing us some real pain here from the standpoint of we're needing to scale, but to maintain economic stability. And yet we're faced with all of these fundamental shifts that are eroding that foundation that we have from a conferral standpoint, including the demographic shift, which is basically that the type of learner that we have always served, that 18 to 24-ish year old undergraduate person, usually upper middle class in the US. That's how we're designed anyway. It doesn't mean that's who we should be serving, but those college age populations are plummeting. And we're right now in the US in particular at the valley of that challenge. And it's going to stay in this spot until probably 2032, 33. And then it'll pick back up just based on the sheer demographics of birth rates. And it'll pick back up, but then it's going to drop again in 2040, 45. So if we aren't adjusting how and who we serve, we're going to run into some challenges, right? So that's forcing us because we have fewer people coming to institutions at a time we need to double the number of conferrals that we're offering. And then you toss onto that this idea of an emerging skills economy that is saying to us, hey, 65% of children who are in the K through 12 system here in the US, the formative system here in the US, and across the world, these are OECD data, by the way, 65% of children are going to be doing jobs that are yet to be invented. And to me, that's a really shocking stat, right? Because if you think about what we're doing at our institutions, we're trying to continue to offer the same degrees in the same pathways that we've offered them for hundreds of years, which is not to suggest that institutions themselves, that there's some timelessness to that. There certainly is, right? But the way that we offer those degree pathways, the way we've designed those degree pathways are running into a fundamental disconnect with those compressive factors that we're seeing in our societies. And so we're just fundamentally not skills aligned. We're not addressing Web3 world and the misalignment of the middle skills, et cetera. And those are the compressive sides of things, right? So throw on top of that reshaping forces, you've got technology and the acceleration of a post-pandemic world where educators are now in a new context and they're being forced to rebalance and balance technology, the science of learning, and their pedagogy. And then questions around, okay, well, is this pedagogical approach rigorous? Is it high quality? Or are we just trying to rush people through to get to a shorter pathway to a degree? Are we playing a game that is thinking about college being an infinite game? In other words, we're creating learners that will continue to grow and learn, or are we just trying to get them through this matriculation period in as short amount of time as possible? And then you get into issues around cost transparency and return on education. And at the end of the day, what you end up with is this massive and almost oppressive situation that it's hard for leaders to see their way out of. And you put that together with an inability to solve actual root cause problems, plus our isomorphic tendencies, which basically means we think in the way of the lived experience of other institutions that we either admire or where we've worked before. And so we try to bring those solutions and we don't contextualize them. And you put all of that together with an inability, and this is where sometimes people get a little frustrated when I say this, but the truth of the matter is we've forgotten how to learn. Whether we're educators within the institution or we're the leaders of the institution or we're staff within an institution, we have given up our ability to learn about our business and our operation and our approach and our pedagogical practices. We might be doing heavy research and learning new things there, but we, in many ways, refuse to learn about our business and our operation and our people and to continue to improve ourselves. And I think that's one of the fundamental challenges that we face. We can't get our way out of this morass if we are not learning.
And if we stay for that actually for a moment, because it's not like universities are not trying, at least that would be my impression. I
Yeah,
see higher education institutions across the board in the United States, here in Europe as well, trying to innovate, especially addressing some of those challenges that you've been talking about in a
yeah.
more larger sense. Will I be able to find a job after graduation? Are the graduates actually ready for the job that I'm offering as an employer? So universities are doing some things in an isolated way, perhaps, but it seems like many of those efforts don't seem to last or scale, or then again, they
Yeah.
don't per se address the underlying issue or root causes you've been talking about. Can you perhaps share an example of a, for example, change initiative that you've seen a university may have started and it looked promising, but it didn't lead to meaningful impact? So I'm looking for actual cases or examples so that we
Yeah.
can unpack it a little bit.
Well, that's a really challenging question because higher ed is so ripe with maladaptations. At its core, almost every air quotes solution that has been brought to bear and that we have a tendency to call innovative refuses to address the existing institution and its way of operating. And even when we have seen some successful transitions using similar approaches to what we talk about adaptive evolution, we are very ready to dismiss those as only applicable to that particular institution. And so, for the most part, what happens is we've just become additive on top of our existing structure, right? So you could pick an initiative where an institution has said, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to revamp our core curriculum. And we do this all the time, particularly in the US, where we said, okay, well, our core curriculum, we're going to revamp that to be more aligned with what the world looks like today. And yet you don't see any change in persistence of learners. You don't see any fundamental change in alignment to job placement or career progression. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is that we're potentially measuring wrong, right? I mean, one of the things we do when we measure job placement in the US is we measure 6 months out of graduation. That doesn't really tell you anything, right? Are you really aligned? No. That's really a brand measure more than it is whether your skills aligned, right? And what we rarely see, with very few exceptions, is anybody willing to go back and think about some of these root challenges, of which I would say the way we measure learning is one of those. And I talk about this in the article. Here in the US, we call it the credit hour. Oftentimes you could call that seat time. But at its core, we still measure learning and how we construct the curricular pathways based on a concept that was developed in the 1880s. And so it's how long did somebody sit in a chair equates to the amount they've learned. And learning science has evolved and grown, especially the literature around this space has grown substantially since that time. And yet we're anchored in this system around a credit hour. It anchors us in how we pay faculty. It anchors us in how we get paid as institutions from our governments or whomever is paying for the learning that we provide. It anchors us in multiple different ways, particularly in how we design learning. And so here in the US, for example, credit courses are usually 3 credit hours long, pretty often on average, right? Which basically says, okay, 50 minutes 3 times a week in the classroom, 2 hours of work outside of the classroom, and therefore that's learning. When you force yourself into that construct, you lose all of the agility. It's very difficult to be adaptive. And so what happens is we sort of leave that to the side. It's hard for us to imagine how we might measure learning differently, how we might think about formative assessment and beyond summative assessment, and how we might, what we call, interleave those formative core curricular skills across a learner's journey. Instead, we say, okay, Baljan, you're going to take this 3 credit hour course your first term, and boom, you've learned critical thinking. But if you didn't, you just get that letter grade for it. And for the rest of your time, that's what you get. You don't ever grow again as a critical thinker. And that is really preventive for us to adapt, right? But what we didn't do when we do these innovative approaches, whether it's we've said, okay, we're more aligned to regional economies and we're going to do workforce development certificates, we're going to tack those on to your journey. Magically, we fixed everything. We haven't touched the core. And if we don't get to those core issues, we're going to continue to only have maladaptations, and we've stacked more expense and more operating approaches onto our institutions.
There's certainly an obsession with measuring what actually doesn't matter at all. So that is also
100%.
something that we
Yeah.
observe. And it really resonated what you said. And maybe it's a good moment for us to actually jump back into this core concept of adaptive evolution. And maybe you can tell us a bit, how does this work in practice? So what does it actually mean, adaptive evolution, for a university who is looking to actually go for that transformation?
Yeah, and I'll confess that there's a lot packed into this 1,500-ish words, and it's unfortunate that I probably could have gone on for many more words here. In fact, I did and had to edit it down. And so you'll find little bits and pieces of a sentence that means something really fundamentally deep that we're focused on or that we can help an organization focus on. But what we tried to do with this particular article was to simplify it down as best we could and to bring in some really key concepts that we married with the core underlying concept, which is called dual transformation. So if any of you want the quickest 1 minute and 30 seconds version of this, there's a YouTube out there about dual transformation. It's not specifically focused on higher education, which is certainly more complex than many, but Google that sucker and watch it, and you'll have a good underlying core premise here. So if we translate that into this article, we've talked about recentering your institution. And in dual transformation terms, that's transformation A, which is basically saying, look, you have to get your house in order. You have to think about getting your organization to a place where you are measuring what matters. You're being more efficient in the provision of learning and the operational approach of the institution. You're not necessarily anchoring yourself in the way we've always done it. You're really being purposeful around and intentional around understanding what is really timeless about your organization and what needs to stick there, and then being able to be timely in how you do things as an organization. So really recentering very intentionally around how you do the business and provision the business of education. And you should be doing that anyway. And sometimes organizations, when they're trying to right their ship or fix themselves, they'll only focus on that piece of it. And so what we say is that's really important, but we also have to recognize the context that we're in. And you have to then go over and figure out how you can become a regenerative institution and how do you catalyze that as a practice. And so in dual transformation parlance, that's what they call transformation B. And you can look at a number of for-profit entities across the world that have gone through this sort of approach and scaled and reimagined their organizations. In higher ed, we aren't saying that you're going to go from being an online book seller to being the world's largest cloud provider. Instead, what we're saying is you have to adapt to be able to design outside of the constraints of your historical approach to education. You have to be able to design in a way that centers a variety of different type of learners. So I was talking with one institution the other day about this idea where how much you marry those two concepts together in an interesting way, right? In one approach, right? So here's the use case that we talked about. There are a lot of this is an institution in Philadelphia in the US, and there are a lot of parents who have first generation children, first generation to go to college, who are coming to that institution. And they have built some infrastructure to support the success of those learners. But even then, the completion rate is still somewhere in the neighborhood of 50%. And there's a lot of reasons that happens. And many of the reasons are anchored in the fact that you have a working parent who lives in inner city Philadelphia, and there's multiple generations who are living in their home and they're working and moving, and they have no concept of the different pressures that their learner is going through in the traditional pathway. And so what we talked about was, well, what would happen if you redesigned the approach here to say, okay, we're not only are we going to support your first coming through our institution in a more traditional fashion, but we're also for no cost going to design a pathway for the parent to get a bachelor's degree. And so what you can't give up in that is, okay, here's our core pathways, our core educational components that we believe in as an institution that we're going to impart on them, whether it's the human skills or the technical skills. But that parent cannot come to your campus and go to class at 8 a.m. They may or may not have access to a computer in their home. Even if they did, do they have access to a quiet place where they can participate in synchronous or asynchronous learning? Do they have the preparation to be able to, or the core belief that they can go through college, right? And so you fundamentally have to differently design your curricular pathway for that particular type of learner. And you have to do it in a way that doesn't add cost, right? That's transformation B. That's catalyzing regeneration, right? Because you're going to learn a whole bunch about how to serve that learner and that learner type that you can then bring back in and recirculate and design for different types of learners. But if you haven't built the core infrastructure to be able to do that, then you aren't going to catalyze regeneration, right? So it's not just the physical space, but it's the infrastructure that you've got to build upon to be able to do that, including your curricular architecture, which we're really afraid of getting to, right? But you need a curricular architecture that allows you to serve multiple different learner types with multiple different modalities and so on and so forth. And then the last thing we talk about is enabling, right? And the core infrastructure piece that I just mentioned is part of this as well. The dual transformation lens here is if you had a circle of transformation A and a circle of transformation B, right in the middle of that would be your capabilities link. We talk about this as creating and significant capabilities for your organization. We think about them as human capabilities, technological capabilities, design capabilities, implementation capabilities, and financial capabilities. We could talk forever about those, but at the core, those are 5 areas that you have to think about your institution and what is defensible that is unique to your organization, and then where might you invest to be able to catalyze growth in both transformation A and transformation B.
The UIIN Conference 2026, where universities, industry, and innovators meet to shape the future. Join us in Stockholm for 3 days of insight, inspiration, and impact. Hear from global thought leaders, expand your network, and be part of the conversations driving collaboration forward. Secure your place now at uiin.org/conference.
Thank you, Cameron. I would like to address an elephant in the room. Actually, I've got 2 elephants that I would like to address. Yes.
All right, let's eat them a piece at a time.
Yes. One is, how can universities ensure that transformation? They may even have motivation and leadership buy-in in place, but where do they get the resources to be able to approach that in such systematic manner that all those 3 pieces that you've described actually could fall in right places? So that is one. And second elephant, what if the leadership buy-in is not there? So what do you do as a change maker that maybe is not per se at the leadership level, but you still have maybe a bit of a decision-making power, and you certainly have the urge to and strength and quick capabilities to make that change happen. But you need your leadership to come in and say, yes, I support you with that.
Yeah, let me address the second question first, because I think this is a fundamental piece of this, right? And I think this is a no fault. We have done a poor job of preparing humans who work in higher education for change, whether that's understanding how the business of higher education works, whether it's leadership development, whether it's programmatic growth pathways that we've designed, whether it is designing incentive structures, although I will point to the Netherlands as an exemplar here in that regard. GELF and the nationwide incentive program, recognition and rewards program that is built there is actually really robust and could be transformative. And so part of our problem is that we just haven't prepared ourselves for the moment, and we continue to ignore the fact that we haven't prepared ourselves for the moment. And there's no fault assigned there. It just isn't how we grow in higher ed. And so I think there's a really important piece of this about being change ready. And this is where I would challenge everybody to be truly introspective here, because there's 3 essential research insights into change several organizations in the literature have pointed to here. The first of these is that individual and organization-wide reactions to change are determining factors in whether that change will be successful. And so if we think about that a little bit more, it means that if our perception is that change is temporary, we're never going to actually facilitate fundamental evolution in our organization. The second research insight is that where there are high levels of trust in leadership, members of the organization will engage in change even before they fully understand the plan. And I have seen numerous institutions where the immediate reaction to, hey, here's where we're going, is what's the plan? And we bake into our institutions of higher education the need for a strategic plan. And yet nothing ever changes because fundamentally all those strategic plans are the same. And so we've eroded trust, and all of these compressive factors we talked about earlier have created this defensive mentality within higher ed that builds upon the incentive structure we have. So one of the core incentive structures that I point to in higher education that erodes trust is the way that we measure faculty progression. Effectively, what we've said is you're only good if you do research. And yet we have this model of teaching, research, and service, and we hardly recognize the research, the service and the teaching piece of this as a growth mechanism. And what that creates is what I call an ecosystem rather than an ecosystem. of learning, right? And so if we can't get past the ego system, we don't have trust, right? So reactions to change is a determining factor. High levels or low levels of trust are a determining factor. And then when members of the organization are part of the change, where they help create the change pathway, they're much more committed to it. So those are sort of three essential elements of change that are required if you're going to move forward. And you can't just simply say we're going to change, right? Because what happens is that you can't get to change ready. And change ready at its core means that we're learning and adapting and changing together, and that we recognize that change is constant. Because if you don't get to that place and you still believe what your underlying mindset is that change is temporary, you get what I would say is there's three personas. You get the person who's sort of a receiver of change, where they're basically saying, our leaders get us through this. Like they're just going to do it. Change is being done to us. We don't have any control over it. And we sort of refraining from taking any action that's going to create any conflict. And we know people who do that, right? You can identify that person almost immediately. You have the resistors. There's people who are saying, my authority comes from pushing back. I'm going to wait this out. And they're just going to control their own sphere and they're going to protect against the chaos of change, right? And we know who those people are immediately as well, right? And then you have the controller, the person who's like, we're going to get through this. I'm going to get us through this. I'm going to control, change, plan it and launch it and manage it. And I'm going to focus on the communication and the telling, and I'm going to drive this change through and then it'll be over, right? And those three personas are consistent through every organization. And so until we can get past that and we can recognize that none of those people have ill intent, they all come to the conversation with positive intent. And we have a conversation about what that means and where we're going to be an agile, change-ready institution, we're not going to see any progression. That gets us to your first question, which was about where do the resources come from? And I think part of our issue here is the way that we've constructed our organizations silos cost in a meaningful way, right? And so change is somebody else's problem. So if you would just get me more students, we would be fine. I don't have to change the way I'm teaching, right? If you faculty would be better at the way you design learning pathways, more students would stay here. That's your problem. Why didn't you fix this, right? If you would just stop having really high quality housing and food, we would be better off, right? We don't need to spend money on that kind of stuff. And the reality is that those levers don't exist in a vacuum. And so where we really have to spend time focusing is on creating the financial capacity that we need, the human capacity in terms of time and space, the capacity to design and otherwise. And I like to call it harvesting for innovation. And that means that we really should think about some of the things we would never think about unless we absolutely had to. And that's hard for leaders to really embrace and to bring forward if you haven't built that trust environment. But I will tell you, we have a lot of waste in the way we run our institutions. They're incredibly inefficient. And in some cases, that's okay. But to your point earlier, Baljan, if we aren't intentional about how we're measuring, we're never going to be able to identify that waste. And the way that we measure our institutions today ignore some of the fundamental signals that are coming out around our financial operations, our progression, our job placement, our alignment with regional economies, our role as an institutional anchor, the depth of our university business cooperation. And you do a lot of work in that space. You can immediately identify how we measure incorrectly, right? Almost everything is transactional in the way that we measure. And yet all of the literature, all of the data show that this is actually about deep relationships. And it's about leveraging our capacities for outcomes that are more comprehensive and intentional. And we just simply say, well, okay, well, how much did you valorize? How many people got placed into jobs, right? Those are all easy to measure things. And until we can get to a place where we're saying, okay, we're going to be really intentional about measuring the stuff that actually matters, we're not going to be able to let loose some of our constraints around how we invest in transformation.
Yes, we do not just measure, we actually manage the performance. Impact doesn't happen in isolation, and change also doesn't happen overnight. That's what I'm hearing. And it's a very powerful message, I think. And I'm just trying to think of what kind of the last question I can ask you, because we're a bit short on time. Okay.
I'm long-winded. I'm sorry.
Maybe that could be it. I can go for much longer, Cameron, as you know.
Me too.
But maybe this could be the final one. So I hope you have also still a confidence that universities can actually make that happen. So what perhaps gives you that confidence that universities can actually navigate this moment that is so important successfully? Let's finish there.
Yeah, I mean, I am really blessed to do work with institutions and organizations that are facilitating this kind of activity on a regular basis. And it's hard work, but I can tell you that there are leaders and faculty who are dedicated to reshaping how they think about their organizations. And many of them are really pushing themselves to be more learner centric, which is a hard question to ask. A lot of faith in our faculty and our leaders on campus that they'll move away from being faculty centric and more to learner centric. And in some cases, that's because they're backed into a corner and they're about to close. But in many, many institutions, they've come to the table and said, we want to collaborate with ourselves and with other institutions. In fact, I was in Wisconsin earlier this week working with an organization there that is really deeply reflecting on its values. And it's a Catholic institution, but is focusing on the values of the Norbertine tradition in Catholicism and how that it makes its way to education. And the time that we spent together was really reflecting them reflecting on how do we hang on to those timeless values and continue to practice them among our own community, respectfully of each other as we go through this transition. And then can we find the right external partners to help us make a change in our approaches? And I have a lot of faith that they're going to be successful because there's hope in the room and there's love in the room and there's intent in the room. And I've been really blessed to work with institutions large and small that are focused on learners and learner success and being more regionally aligned than they've ever been before. And part of that is because of the compressive factors, but part of it's because they recognize that their impact really matters and that they need to dig in. And if they want to extend impact for hundreds of more years, they're going to have to be more reflective and more self-aware individually and institutionally to be both timeless and timely.
Thank you so much, Cameron. It was a pleasure. There's a lot in there that I think will certainly resonate with many of our listeners. And also thanks to everyone who joined us today. We hope this conversation has given you not just ideas, it certainly did for me, but also a clearer sense of where to focus if you're looking to move beyond incremental change and if you care about impact, which I know you do. So thank you so much, Cameron. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. And thanks to everybody who joined us today.
Have a good day, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to today's discussion. Follow UIN on LinkedIn, and if you are enjoying our podcast, make sure to subscribe, rate, and review in your podcast platform of choice to help other people find this content too.